Good evening, YouTube. Andrew Sellers here, and I'm about to bring you all my Eradicator deck profile. As many of you have seen, I had a best 2 out of 3 Vanguard match against Andrew Condrick in Premium with this deck. Game 1, I ended up beating him because I pulled the OT while his Vanguard was Gize and while he was at 5 damage. Games 2 and 3, he won against me from stalling out with Gize pretty much. But man, I gotta say, Andrew Condrick is one of the best card fighters I've come up against, and in my opinion, the strongest in Florida. And I also want to once again give Andrew Condrick a big congrats to making it 10th place at Worlds. And now I'm ready to get on with the profile. Standard starter, self-explanatory. Next up, I've got Dragvidia for the Overtrigger, 3 draw PG, 4 crit, and 4 of the 20k fronts. 24k. The Overtrigger self-explanatory. I run 3 of the PGs because I run a copy of Elemental Sanctitude in my grade 1 lineup, and let's see. I run the Stride crit because you get enough in hand already and you need it for the extra striding. And I run the 20k front because the 20k shield is nice, and also because fronts really help with helping this deck power up more. Fronts may not be needed in Vanquisher necessarily, but I definitely think they're needed in Eradicators. Next up, grade 1s. 1 Elemental Sanctitude. 2 Mighty Bolt Dragoon. Standard grade 3 Searcher that can swing for 13k. And boost as well. 4 Demolition Dragon. When this dude here hit, when an attack that he lands or a boosted unit or a unit that he boosts lands, you draw 1 card, and if your opponent has units in their drop zone, you send them to the soul, and then you choose which card in your opponent's drop zone to bind. He's helpful for hand resources, he's a decent first ride, and he's also good for helping Vowing Saber trigger more. 4 Nusku, in my opinion, the best grade 1 and one of the best cards in this whole deck. Getting to search the top 5 for any Eradicator unit is absolutely amazing. Now for grade 2s. 4 Spark Rays Dragon. In my opinion, he's this deck's best first ride. When he's placed on Vanguard, he gets plus 5k, then you check the top 5 for any Eradicator unit, add 1 to your hand if you want to. And if you chose to add 1, you discard 1 from your hand afterwards. And if his attack hits while he's on Vanguard or Rearguard, you Soul Blast 1 and draw a card. Pretty good card. Now I'm running 4 copies of a card that I originally played at 3. 4 Spark Rain Dragon. I used to play him at 3, but I started playing him at 4 because you bind a lot, and I really appreciate having a unit that gets plus 1k for each card in both players' bind zones for free. Like this card's first skill is bonkers. Its second one is Counterblast 1, bind itself, then your opponent chooses every unit in the same column as the Spark Rain you've bound, and then they bind all the units from that column. But I've rarely ever had to use that skill because I usually bind enough anyway, and he's really just there for the power bonus. Like, his power bonus skill is stupid. Now, 3 Zuitan. You only really need him on rearguard. His skill is, when an opponent's rearguard is bound, he gets plus 5k. And after he attacks, if your opponent has no rearguards in their front row, you move him to the soul and draw a card. Finally, for grade 2s, 3 Suhail. 19k beat stick while on an Excel circle, and when he's placed, you discard a card from your hand, choose an opponent's rearguard in the front row and bind it, and then you draw a card. Now for the grade 3s. First up, 4 Heal. Self-explanatory why this is in the deck. 4 copies of Vowing Saber Reverse. As many of you know, his skill has lots of reading involved in it. One of them is you counterblast 1, choose one of your rearguards and lock it, and your opponent chooses a card from their hand, drop zone, and rearguard and binds each card. His first auto skill is when your opponent's normal unit is bound. If it's a trigger unit, it won't. If it's a trigger unit or an order card, it will not resolve. But if your opponent's normal unit specifically gets bound, your opponent either binds a card with the same name, a normal unit with the same name as that bound unit from their deck, and then you choose one of your units and give it plus 5,000 power, or they can decide not to bind, and you get to give one of your units 10,000 power instead. And his final skill is when it swings while you're at 4 or more damage, and if you have Vowing Saber on your rearguard or in your soul, you counterblast 1 and restand all your rearguards. And finally, for grade 3s, 4 Descendant. He and Vowing Saber, in my opinion, both work really, really well, especially when you have lots of open counterblasts and when you have 4 or more damage. One of his skills is you Soul Blast 1, choose an opponent's front row rearguard and bind it, and then they choose a rearguard from their back row and move it up to the front. And his big skill is on Vanguard. If his attack does not hit, you counterblast 1, discard a card from hand, restand it, and it gets -1 drive check. Oh, and then his other big skill is when he's ridden, he absorbs all the skills of the unit it rides upon for the turn. The amazing thing about this guy is that if you ride him on Vowing Saber while you have open counterblasts and while you're at 4 or 5 damage, your opponent won't have a choice but to take Descendant's attack. Now for the grade 4s. Stunverse. Just as I've mentioned in my updated Vanquisher profile, the Stunverse hit was completely necessary. If it was still at any higher than 1, it would still be a really busted card. Now it's become situational and balanced at this point. Like, you can't just stride him on any turn. You gotta stride him on turns that will either kill your opponent or will leave him with nothing on their with either nothing or without much on their board and in their hand at the end of the turn. You basically either want to kill them or make it hard for them to recover from using his skill. And you specifically want to stride him when you ride Descendant on top of Vowing Saber. That way you can attack, that way after you use Stunverse's skill, you can swing with Descendant while it's absorbed Vowing Saber's skill. Next up, to Exterminate Dragon. Another situational card in this deck. When he's placed on rearguard, you when he's stridden on Vanguard Circle, you Soul Blast 1, and you draw a card for every open rear guard in your opponent's front row. And his other skill is you once per turn counterblast 1, and you give your whole front row plus 10k for each of your opponent's open rear guard circles in the front row. 2 V-Buster. His skills are once per turn, choose another V-Buster from your G-Zone and flip it face up. Your opponent chooses a card from his or her rear guard and in their drops and a unit from their drop zone and binds them. And then if you have more rear guards than your opponent, you choose 3 of your units and give them 3,000 power. And his GB3 skill is Thunderstrike 7. Meaning if your opponent has 7 or more bound units, all of your front row rear guards get plus 5k. And V-Buster gets a crit and a drive during each of your turns. 2 VMAX. One of his skills is once per turn, flip another voltage up from your G-Zone. And he gets, when this unit's attack hits, your opponent chooses one of their rear guards and retires it. And then they choose up to 2 cards from their drop zone and bind them. And then his GB3 skill is during your turn, all of the units in your front row get plus 3,000 power for each card in the opponent's bind zone. Now for your situational 5 damage guy, VMAX. You only really use them if your opponent's at 5 damage so that you can inflict 1 damage to them. That's really it. One of the GB8. When stridden, GB8. Both you and your opponent bind every card from their drop zone, and your opponent binds all their rear guards as well. And your whole board gets plus 2,000 power for each card in both players' bind zones. Really busted card. Next up, finally the G Guardians. 3 Counteract Dragon. This guy is basically free. For those of you that don't know the skill, it is when he's placed on G Guardian, your opponent chooses what rear guards they want to bind. They have the option of doing it. If they choose to bind, and if they choose not to bind rear guards, this guy gets plus 10 for each rear guard. For each rear guard they've chosen not to bind. So if they were to choose to keep their rear guards, he gets plus 20,000 shield. If they choose to bind 1, he gets plus 10. But if they actually choose to bind their rear guards, it will get no power. But if you use this guy while your opponent has no rear guards, then you will get free power. This card's so free. 2 Bulwark Dragon. His skill is Thunderstrike 3. He gets plus 10,000 shield, and after it's placed in the Guardian Circle, your opponent chooses 1 rear guard for every 3 cards in your opponent's every 4 cards actually, sorry. Every 4 cards in your opponent's bind zone and retires them. And finally, 2 Impede Dragon. Basically, Denial Griffin, except you retire one and bind one by flipping a card from your G-Zone. And that is it for my Eradicator deck profile. I really hope you all enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, like, and subscribe for more content, and I'll be sure to bring more of it for you guys. Have a good night, everyone.